Thank you all for coming first in this terrible weather on this terrible day. As you can see from the title on the screen, I'm going to be talking today about the poet Jibanananda Das. Jibanananda Das lived in Bengal during the first half of the 20th century. And I'm going to focus, again, as you can see from the screen, on a particular volume of his poems called Rupashi Bangla, Beautiful Bengal. I'm going to focus on a couple of those poems. Rupashi Bangla is a series of sonnets which describe the landscape in which Jibanananda Das lived. He was from Whitechapel, which is now in Bangladesh. He was born there, grew up there, and spent quite a lot of his adult life there as well. Now, I personally came across the poems of Rupashi Bangla quite late when I went to Bangladesh a few years ago. I went to see a museum set up by Jahanara Imam. Jahanara Imam, some of you may know, has a lot of roles, but one of the things that she did was she wrote a memoir about the war of 1971 from her perspective as a Dhaka housewife. She wrote particularly about her son Rumi, who joined up as a freedom fighter in that war. He was actually captured by the Pakistani army and he never returned to the liberated Bangladesh. And this museum that she set up was very much a memorial to her son, Rumi. And one of the exhibits that particularly struck me was a framed poem. And even with my quite basic Bengali, I could read the first line of this poem. And the first line of this poem was, Abar ashibo fire, danshirer tire, ei Bangla. And this translates as, I will return again to the banks of the Dhansiri River in this Bengal. And at the time, this seemed to me a very affecting and poignant line of poetry, because, of course, Jahanara Imam's teenage son had never returned from the war. Now, the rest of the poem was beyond my fairly basic Bengali reading, so later on I looked it up, and that's when I discovered it was from this volume, Rupashi Bangla, by Jibanananda Das. Now, before we read the translation of the poem together, I'd like you all to listen to it in Bengali, because you can hear the musicality of the language, which is something really that a translation can't convey. So if we listen to it first.
আবার আসিব ফিরে ধানসিঁড়িটির তীরে এই বাংলায়, হয়তো মানুষ নয়, হয়তো বা শঙ্খ চিল শালিখের বেশে, হয়তো ভোরের কাক হয়ে এই কার্তিকের নবান্নের দেশে কুয়াশার বুকে ভেসে একদিন আসিব এই কাঁঠাল ছায়ায়, হয়তো হাঁস হব কেশরীর ঘুঙুর রহিবে লাল পায়, সারাদিন কেটে যাবে কলমির গন্ধ ভরা জলে ভেসে ভেসে, আবার আসিব আমি বাংলার নদী মাঠ ক্ষেত ভালোবেসে, জলাঙ্গির ঢেউয়ে ভেজা বাংলার সবুজ করুণ ডাঙায়, হয়তো দেখিবে যে সুদর্শন উড়িতেছে সন্ধ্যার বাতাসে, হয়তো শুনিবে এক লক্ষ্মী পেঁচা ডাকিতেছে শিমুলের ডালে, হয়তো খইর ধান ছড়াতেছে শিশু এক উঠানের ঘাসে, রূপসার খোলা জলে হয়তো কিশোর এক সাদা ছেঁড়া পানি ডিঙা পায়। রাঙা মেঘ সাঁতরায় অন্ধকারে আসিতেছে নিড়ে, দেখিবে ধাবুর বাঘ আমারই পাপিত ইহাদের ভিড়ে।
So I'm going to hand that round now for us to read in translation. As I read it to you in translation, I hope you'll have the same experience that I did, which is that by the end of the poem, you don't just see this landscape that Jibanananda Das is describing, but as a reader, you almost become part of it. So, when I return to the banks of the Don Shiri, to this Bengal, not as a man perhaps, but as a shalik bird or white hawk, perhaps as a dawn crow, in this land of autumn's red harvest, I'll float upon the breast of the fog one day in the shade of a jackdaw tree. Or I'll be some young girl's pet duck, ankle bells upon her reddened feet, and I'll spend the day floating on duckweed-scented waters, when again I come, smitten by Bengal's rivers and fields, to this green and kindly land, Bengal, moistened by the Jalangi River's waves. Perhaps I'll watch the buzzards soar on sunset's breeze. Perhaps I'll listen to a spotted owl screeching from a shimmel tree branch. Perhaps a child scatters puffed rice upon the grass of some home's courtyard. On the Rupashi River's murky waters, a youth perhaps steers his dinghy with its torn white sail. Reddish clouds scud by, and in the darkness, coming to their nest, I shall see white herons. Among them all is where you'll find me. So this poem, in a lot of ways, illustrates what I mean when I say in the title to my talk that Jibanananda Das is a poet for Bengal and what's now Bangladesh, but he's also a poet for the world. Now, if you're familiar with the landscape of Bangladesh, you'll immediately recognise it in this poem. In fact, for Bangladeshis of a certain generation, Jibanananda Das is inextricably linked with the 1971 war and the land of Bangladesh. The poems describing Barishal in East Bengal came to be seen as defining the land which the freedom fighters fought for in that war. And there's a much repeated story about a young freedom fighter in a training camp who was asked what he would have liked if he was asked for only one thing in the world. And he said he would have liked a copy of Jibanananda Das's Rupashi Bangla. And in fact, in the 9 months of that war, this volume of poems was reprinted twice in East Bengal. Now, if like me, you're less familiar with Bangladesh, Jibanananda Das writes in such a way that you not only see the unfamiliar landscape that he describes in this poem, but you become part of it, you want to explore it. So, for example, as a reader, you become the crow, you see the red harvest. Like the crow, you feel the coolness of the fog and the shade of the jackdaw tree. you become this duck hearing this girl's ankle bells, and you smell the pond's duckweeds. So if I just read those lines so you can see that. When I return to the banks of the Don Shiri, to this Bengal, not as a man perhaps, but as a shullick bird or white hawk, perhaps as a dawn crow in this land of autumn's red harvest, I'll float upon the breast of the fog one day in the shade of a jackdaw tree. Or I'll be some young girl's pet duck, ankle bells upon her reddened feet, and I'll spend the day floating on duckweed-scented waters. So when I read this poem and experienced it, I became curious about the writer. I mean, I wanted to know what kind of a man felt so passionately about the land that he lived, that when he described it, he actually made the reader feel part of that land also. And so I began to read about Jibanananda Das. I read about him in essays by academics and also in a biography by Clinton Seeley, who was Professor of Bengali at Chicago University. Now, Jibanananda Das was born in the last year of the 19th century in Barishal, as I've said, which is now part of Bangladesh. His father was a school teacher. His father and his grandfather were Brahmos, which is a reformed Hindu sect, though Jibanananda Das himself wasn't an active Brahmo. He studied first in Barishal, and then he went to Calcutta, where he did an English degree at Presidency College. And in the 1920s, he worked as an English teacher, an English professor, in colleges mainly in Calcutta. And then in 1930, he returned to his birthplace of Borisov, newly married, and there he also lectured in English. And he remained in Borisov for the next 16 years, until 1946, when he left for Calcutta just before partition. And he died prematurely in 1954, when he was run over by a tram. So in many ways, Jibanananda Das lived very much the typical middle-class life of a middle-class Bengali man of the time, studying and teaching both in Calcutta and his hometown of Borisov. But what really began to interest me as I was reading about Jibanananda Das was the way in which critics viewed the world that he described in Rupashi Bangla. And in these slides that I'm about to show you, the italics are mine. So the critics seem to describe this world as almost a retreat into a pastoral fantasy. So Clinton Seeley, his biographer, wrote of how he lived in a fanciful world, one which he experienced through senses heightened by a fertile, somewhat overwrought imagination. And another critic writes of how the poetic world of Jibanananda Das is self-contained and contemplative, suffused by gentle introspection. So there's a sense in which these critics see Rupashi Bangla as almost a retreat from the realities of urban life in Calcutta. It's a pastoral fantasy. And even those critics who praise it focus very much on the almost photographic realism of this description. And yet, as I thought about it, I thought, well, this book of poems was part of the inspiration for a generation of young people to risk and sometimes lose their lives in fighting for their country. Now, these people clearly hadn't seen these poems as self-contained or fanciful or filled with introspection. I imagine they'd also seen it as much more than a purely realistic description of the countryside. They'd seen, these freedom fighters had seen reflected in these poems their political beliefs that led them to fight for Bangladesh. So I began to look at Jibanananda Das's life to explore his attitude to the politics of the time. Now, Das certainly wasn't actively political. He wasn't like his contemporary, the poet Qabi Nazrul Islam. He didn't spend times in the prisons of British India for opposition to British rule. He wasn't like Rabindranath Tagore, who was involved actively in easing Hindu-Muslim communal tensions at the time. So Tagore in 1905, when the British first suggested partitioning the then combined East and West Bengal, Tagore encouraged Muslims and Hindus to tie cloth bracelets around each other's wrists to symbolise their unity. And yet, Jibanananda Das's life, like really everybody, every Indian at that time preceding partition, was very much affected by the political currents of this time. And in particular, this growth of distrust between Muslims and Hindus, or communalism, that grew with the force of Indian nationalism. So Jibanananda Das, as I've said, was a Hindu Brahmin by birth, if not by practice, and he lived in East Bengal. Now, before partition, East Bengal's Hindu population was about 30% of the population, but the population wasn't evenly spread throughout the province. It was higher in some areas, such as the south, in places like Khulna and Barishal. So Jibanananda Das, as I've said, was from Barishal. So he was born and brought up in an area with a mix of Hindus and Muslims. And he had good relationships with his Muslim neighbours. Clinton Seeley, his biographer, writes of how his wife said that part of the reason he left Barishal in 1946 was because his Muslim neighbours advised him that the arrival of Bihari Muslims from India would make the area unsafe for him. And this was good advice because there were serious communal riots in Barishal in 1950. Jibanananda Das, though, I think, was very sympathetic to the idea of Hindus and Muslims living side by side in India, as he'd experienced in Barishal. And we see this very obviously in an early poem of his, written again after communal riots, this time in Calcutta. And this poem was written in 1926. And the poem's called Hindu Musalman, or Hindus and Muslims. And some of the poem, it's a long poem, reads, "In this auspicious land of India, Hindu puja bells mix joyously with melodies from Muslim namaz. Hindu morning worship here begins amid the Muslim call for prayer. At dawn and dusk, Vedic chants blend with the Quran's verse. Sannyasi and Pir here intertwine, as do the temple and the mosque." Now, as I said, though Jibanananda Das wasn't directly involved in politics, his life was directly affected by the communalism that, as I said, grew with the force of nationalism in pre-partition India. In fact, part of the reason that Das had to return from Calcutta to Barishal was because of these communal tensions. In Calcutta, he taught in a Brahmo college called City College, and the college's halls of residence were open to students of all faiths. But they had a rule that carrying out acts of congregational worship was forbidden on college premises, so students could worship outside the college. Now, in 1928, some Hindu students, despite this rule, held a Saraswati Puja. So this is a festival dedicated to the goddess of learning. So they held this puja dedicated to the goddess of learning in their halls of residence, which is contrary to college rules. Now, this particular puja was being increasingly celebrated in the 1920s, but it was also often linked with religious tensions. And this proved to be the situation in this case. The college authorities tried to fine the students protested, and in the end, there was so much uproar that the college was actually closed early for its summer vacation. But the ramifications were much longer lasting. College enrolment, as a result of this, fell by 50%. And the college had to let 11 teachers go, including Jibanananda Das. So part of the reason that Das returned to Barishal was as a result of him losing his job, and he'd lost this job because of communal tensions. And while he was in Barishal in the 1930s, this was the point at which he wrote the sonnets, Rupashi Bangla. So, as you can see, even if Jibanananda Das wasn't actively involved in the politics of his day, he was affected by it. He lost his job because of it, effectively. Now, the poem of 1926 is a very clear call for Hindu-Muslim unity and tolerance. And actually, the words of this poem reflect a poster, which some of you may recognise, which was popular after the 1971 war, in Bangladesh, and it expresses a mood of inclusion in the country that followed the Liberation War. And the poster shows a temple, a mosque, a pagoda and a church linked together. And the words there read, Banglar Hindu, Banglar Musalman, Banglar Boito, Banglar Christian, Amrai Shobai Bengali. which translates as you can see there, Bengal's Hindus, Bengal's Muslims, Bengal's Buddhists, Bengal's Christians. We are all Bengali. Now, in the next slide, I've put this poster next to some of the lines from that poem, Hindu Musalman, by Jibanananda Das. And you say here, he says that Sanasi and Pir intertwine, as do the temple and the mosque. And it's almost as though this poem reads as a gloss to the poster. So you've got there the temple, the mosque, the pagoda, the church, all linked. And in this poem, he, in a similar way, is talking about the temple and the mosque being intertwined. Now, as Jibanananda Das matured as a poet, he came to feel that making such obvious political messages in poetry led to work that was clumsy and inelegant. And I think this is sometimes why you read in critics that he's apolitical, he's not a political poet. He certainly isn't an obviously political poet. And you see this kind of thought process in his later essays. So after the death of Rabindranath, he wrote an essay called Rabindranath and Modern Poetry. And in that, he writes that journalistic and propagandist writing differs from poetry in that the former, so journalism and propaganda, lack unity, purity, and freedom of expression, rarefied through experience, the very qualities which inform poetry. And later on, in 1943, in an essay called The Responsibility of the Writer and Writing, he writes that thoughts and conclusions and problems and ideology remain hidden in true poetry. Now, he's not saying that he doesn't believe in politics in poetry, he doesn't have ideology, he doesn't have a political message, but what he is saying is that it shouldn't be obvious through the poetry, you should feel it through the poetry, it shouldn't be like propaganda. And it seems to me that in the light of those views, if you take on what he was saying about how he wrote poetry, Rupashi Bangla is very much political in an implicit rather than an explicit way. So if you compare these lines from the poem that we've just read from Rupashi Bangla, when again I come, smitten by Bengal's rivers and fields, to this green and kindly land, Bengal, moistened by the Jalangi's river's waves. Perhaps I'll watch the buzzards soar on a sunset's breeze. Perhaps I'll listen to a spotted owl screeching from a shumul tree branch. Perhaps a child scatters puffed rice upon the grass of some home's courtyard. Now, if you compare those to the lines below, which is from this much earlier poem, 1926 poem, Hindu Musalman, in this auspicious land of India, Hindu puja bells mix joyously with melodies from Muslim namaz. Hindu morning worship here begins amid the Muslim call for prayer. At dawn and dusk, Vedic chants blend with the Quran's verse. Sanasi and Pir here intertwine, as do the temple and the mosque. Now, the second poem reads really like slogans from propaganda. I mean, a very kind of benign sort of propaganda, but still, it's quite a bare kind of poem. The lines don't involve the reader's senses. You don't really feel the temples. You don't feel the mosques. And if you contrast that to the lines from the sonnet in Rupashi Bangla, Das uses our senses to almost, again, physically transmit the experience of being in Bengal to the reader. So you can feel the waves, you can hear the owl calling, you can see the grains of rice on the courtyard floor. So Jibanananda Das uses what he saw as the attributes of poetry, what he described, if I just go back, in his essay as unity, purity, and freedom of expression rarefied through experience. So he uses, he writes with unity, purity, and freedom of expression rarefied through experience. He actually transmits his experience of the country physically through his verse. And he uses that to convey that Bengal belongs to us all, which at the time was a very political message. Don't forget, this is a time of partition, or pre-partition. And his poetry makes that land belong to us all, whatever our religious beliefs. But as he discusses in his essays, his ideology remains hidden, and that makes the poetry much stronger, I think. And I think it's that feeling that permeates the poems of Rupashi Bangla that Bengal belongs to us all, that led the freedom fighters to have such great affection for this volume of poems. His poetry, Jibanananda's poetry, isn't self-contained, as some critics have said, or a fanciful world experienced through overwrought imagination, as other critics have said. Rather, the intensity with which he experienced the landscape is literally conveyed to the reader in his poems. The poems make us not just see, as I hope you've seen through this poem, but also feel Bengal. Jibanananda Das's message is that Bengal belongs to us all. We all experience Bengal. And I've subtitled this talk, as you'll see, Rupashi Bangla's History, Myth and Dream. And it was, I think, Jibanananda Das's historical experiences of communism that led him to write about Bengal as something that we could all experience. It was a message of unity, really, in these poems. And yet the poems also, they're almost a lament. Because, of course, in the end, because of partition, because of the fears of communalist violence, he had to abandon Barishaw. He had to go and live in Calcutta. And so Bengal, Barishaw, existed for him only as a dream at the end of his life. So that gives a poignancy to the poems, I think. Now, to a large extent, the poems of Jibanananda Das do embrace us all. And they pull us all into the experience of seeing and feeling the landscape of Bengal, as I hope you've seen from the poem that we've read. But it's also true, I certainly felt, that some of the poems, or at least parts of them, are quite difficult to access. And I think this is seen in the second and the last of the poems that I'm going to look at today, which is called Bangla Mukh Ami Dekhechi. So I'm just going to put that up. Sorry. Right. Oops. Guys, just copy the link.
Let me see if I can open it. Why is this happening? I can try. Yeah, you can copy the link.
Yeah, let's just copy the link.
Alright, okay, let's just copy the link. Technical difficulties. Where's the internet? What the Sorry, one sec. There you go.
Oh, is that right? That's right, thank you. Okay, thank you.
বাংলার মুখ আমি দেখিয়াছি, তাই আমি পৃথিবীর রূপ খুঁজিতে যাই না আর। অন্ধকারে জেগে উঠে ডুমুরের গাছে চেয়ে দেখি, ছাতার মতন বড় পাতাটির নিচে বসে আছে ভোরের দোয়েল পাখি। চারিদিকে চেয়ে দেখি পল্লবের স্তূপ, জাম, বট, কাঁঠালের হিজলের অসথের করিয়াছে চুপ। কোনি মনসার ঝোপে সটিবনি তাহাদের ছায়া পড়িয়াছে। মধুকর ডিঙি থেকে না জানি সে কবে চাঁদ চম্পার কাছে এমনি হিজল বট তমালের নীল ছায়া বাংলার অপরূপ রূপ দেখেছিল। বেহুলাও একদিন গাঙ্গুরের জলে ফেলা নিয়ে কৃষ্ণা দ্বাদশীর জ্যোৎস্না যখন মরিয়া গেছে নদীর চড়ায়, সোনালি ধানের পাশে অসংখ্য অসত্য বট দেখেছিল। হায়, শ্যামার নরম গান শুনেছিল। একদিন অমরায় গিয়ে ছিন্ন খঞ্জনার মতো যখন সে নেচেছিল ইন্দ্রের সভায়, বাংলার নদী, মাঠ, ভাট ফুল ঘুঙুরের মতো তার কেঁদেছিল পায়।
Okay, well, I'm just going to hand round that poem now, the second one of the poems we're going to look at, so that we can read it in translation again. So if I read it to you again, I have looked upon the face of Bengal, the world's beauty. I need no longer seek. In the darkness I awake and glimpse in a fig tree, sitting beneath umbrella-like foliage, the early morning magpie. I see all around piles of leaves, of jam, banyan, jackfruit, cashew, ashwatha, lying still. Shade falls upon the cactus clumps, upon the shatti grove. I know not when Chand from Champa, upon his boat, the honeybee, had seen Bengal's exquisite beauty, the same blue shadows of cashew, banyan, thamul. Bahula on a raft upon the river, when the moon's sliver died away behind some sandy shoal, had seen many an ashwatha and banyan beside the golden paddy, had heard Siama's soft song, once had gone to Amara, and when she danced, like a clip-winged wagtail bird at Indra's court, rivers, fields, bud blossoms wept like ankle bells upon her feet. Now, the first 6 lines of that poem have that sense that I've expressed of being literally pulled into the landscape of Bengal. We feel it with all our senses. It's trees, the different types of foliage, it's light and woods, and it's bird life. We almost become the morning magpie. So if I just read you those 6 lines again so you can feel that. I have looked upon the face of Bengal, the world's beauty I need no longer seek. In the darkness, I awake and glimpse in a fig tree, sitting beneath umbrella-like foliage, the early morning magpie. I see all around piles of leaves of jam, banyan, jackfruit, cashew, ashwatha, lying still. Shade falls upon the cactus clumps, upon the shatti grove. The next 8 lines, though, threw me when I read them. Those first 6 lines is very much the experience that we've discussed of being drawn into something that's either familiar to you, or if it's not familiar to you, you're made to feel that it's familiar to you. But the next 8 lines, I say, when I read them, even in translation, they threw me, because they clearly, if I just go back, they clearly reference characters from a much older story, these characters called Chand and Bahula, with whom I was completely unfamiliar. And these characters are actually part of a series of frequent references to pre-modern religious literature, religious narratives that are scattered throughout Rupashi Bangla. And I've called them myths in the subtitle to my talk, Rupashi Bangla as History, Myth and Dream. The Oxford English Dictionary defines a myth as a traditional story, especially concerning the early history of a people, often involving supernatural beings. Now, when I looked up this narrative poem about Chand and his daughter-in-law, Bahula, and how she wins back the life of Chand's son and her husband, who has been killed by a snake he's called Lakinder, and she wins back his life by dancing before the gods. And there's no doubt that being aware of these references does add a depth to the poems in Rupashi Bangla. It also links Bengal to its pre-modern literary heritage. At the same time, though, those last 8 lines, they contain several references back to the natural description, both in the first 6 lines of the poem and descriptions of Bengal throughout the other poems. So you've got references to Bengal's Ashwatha and banyan trees, the golden rice fields, the rivers and blossoms, and these are the same for Bahula and Chand as they are for the reader. So I'll read the last 8 lines of that poem again, so you can see this. I know not when Chand from Champa, upon his boat, the honeybee, had seen Bengal's exquisite beauty, the same blue shadows of cashew, banyan, tamil. Bahula on a raft upon the river, when the moon sliver died away behind some sandy shore, had seen many an Ashwatha and banyan beside the golden paddy, had heard Sima's soft song, once had gone to Amara, and when she danced like a clip-winged wagtail bird her Indra's court, rivers, fields, bunth blossoms wept like ankle bells upon her feet. So again, this reinforces for me that for Jibanananda Das, the land of Bengal belonged to everybody. He uses these mythic characters from a particular literary tradition, and the land of Bengal belongs to the people who understand and know about that tradition. It belongs also to those characters themselves, because they inhabited that land. But it also belongs to those who, like me, know nothing of that tradition, because the experience of the Bengal landscape is available to all of us. The experience that Bahula and Chand had is the same as the experience that we have when we're viewing it. So, to sum up really now, going back to my title, for me, I said Rupashi Bangla is history, myth and dream. So for me, the poems are very much written from the particular historical context of Jibanananda Das. Virtually everybody in India at that time was affected by the forces of communalism, and Das had experienced those directly when he had to give up his job and come back to Barisal. But the poems also read almost as a lament for the land of Bengal that he feared he might lose, again as a result of communal tensions. And in fact, he did have to go back to Calcutta in the last few years of his life because of these fears of communal tension. Now, they're also informed by myth, as I've said, by a specific tradition of pre-modern Bengali verse, which, on the one hand, encourages the reader to explore those traditions, but it also makes the point that the land of Bengal doesn't really require a knowledge of any particular set of traditions. Bengal's strength and power is such that it stands outside tradition and myth. So that's myth. And I've also said dream, because the dream in the poems is that they take the land of Bengal to all its readers, suggesting that it belongs to all who experience it, which was what attracted the freedom fighters during the 71 war. Now, in a world that's increasingly riven by religious factionalism, I think that's a very contemporary message. That's a dream that we really need to hold on to. Thank you. So So does anybody have any questions?
sit or?
Yeah, and I'll sit down. I'm not an expert by any means. If anybody wants to tell me something about that, I'm quite happy to listen.
Any questions?
Go on, Julia.
I wondered how much, I'm not familiar with his poetry, but how much he wrote about people,
He did.
like stories
Yeah.
of people.
That's interesting because these poems he doesn't really. There aren't really any people at all, as in real people, in these stories. Later on, he does start to write really. His poems, sort of after partition, are much more kind of, in a way, they're more obviously political. Actually, you know, he seems to be obviously trying to convey a message, although it's not quite clear what that message was because so much was going on, and you know who could work it out. So he does write. You know, he writes poems called things like The Beggar, which are much more about people. But in a way, it's these poems I think that are the most deeply felt. Because that's not his experience. You know, I mean, I'm not saying you can only write your own experience, but these are the poems that you really feel as a reader because he transmits that experience that he had. But yeah, he does write about people, but not in Rupashi Bangla at all. Go on.
Hi. Thank you for this. It's really interesting. I don't know anything about this poet, and I don't really know that much about Bengal, being of Punjabi origin.
Well, I don't know a huge amount either.
But when you were talking, I was just thinking that. Well, the poems, I found myself thinking of, he was an English professor, so he would have known a lot about English poets. And you know, there's that poem that was written at the end of the First World War, My Green and Pleasant Land, he talks about England being the green and pleasant, and Bengal as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
And also that with all this climate change stuff going on just now, that he would have seen how capitalism, the Industrial Revolution, was destroying the green and pleasant land of England. Yeah. And similarly, it would do.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a sense of that, that this is a land that he wants to hold on to, and that we need to hold on to. But at the same time, you know, he's not retreating into that land. He's saying we need to, by making us experience and see the value of that land, he's making us say, well, we need to protect this land. It's not a fantasy that you say, oh, well, you know, there's Calcutta, it's all urban and like it's all industrialised, I'm going to go back to the village and live my little village life separate from that. He's very much aware that this is, they coexist and they need to coexist, and he wants to protect that country by making us, you know, even someone like me who, I mean, I've been to Bangladesh, but I've never been to Burrishaw. I haven't really been far into the countryside. But, you know, having read these poems, and interesting, I've actually been doing a talk about climate change in Bangladesh recently because I'm a teacher as well. This is, it is very contemporary because this is a land that we are losing. Literally in Bangladesh, we're losing it to, floods and the seas rising. So it does have a very contemporary resonance. And the stuff about him being an English professor, of course, it's written as a sonnet, which is a European, it's a 14-line sort of love poem, basically. But he's writing a love poem to the country. You know, he doesn't write it as romantic love poems. Each of these poems are a love poem to Bengal. So yeah, I mean, all of that makes I mean, I think he is a very. There's this tendency to kind of dismiss him as a bit of a mystic. Well, I think in what I've read from him, as a bit of a mystic, as somebody who's a bit kind of not really kind of involved in the world as it was going on. He's a bit dreamy, but I do think, as you say, he's very much a contemporary poet with contemporary concerns. Thank you.
The Brahmo Samaj version of Hinduism is very much of bringing everybody together.
Yeah, it is. It's yeah.
So the Hindu-Muslim tensions, they would be above that. They would see, well, you look at humanity.
Yeah. Well, I think although he wasn't an active member of, he wasn't an active Brahmo like his father and grandfather was. Obviously, he was very influenced by that kind of, and his father and grandfather were very active in the Brahmo Samaj. So I'm sure that the fact that he was a Brahmo, the fact that he lived in a place, because not all of Bengal, either west or east, was actually almost half and half. I mean, Khulna was 50%. Khulna's next to Barisal. It was 50% Hindu, and yet it came to Bangladesh. Barisal, East Barisal, there was a large number of Hindu people there. So it was a place. He grew up in a place where very much it was people side by side, and that was what both through faith and experience I think he wanted to see.
from his poems, what you have so far described, he was very much a poem through the contemporary nature of Bengal. Describe birds, plants, flowers, rivers, and so forth. But he also had a very distinctive romantic poems, he did it.
You mean like Ballad Sen, those sorts of poems?
Like, I could bring the book, which I had his whole composition, but he's describing, he's making a journey through the different areas, like Singhal means Ceylon, and then going to the Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean, and then coming back, meeting to a lady, or lady of Nator.
Yeah, this is Ballad of Sen. Yeah.
Russia. And he gets all the peace in life within the unmolded of that lady when she comes back to his journey. That's I gathered from that poem.
I know the poem you mean. And I think it's interesting because I haven't really looked at the kind of romantic aspect, but also throughout these poems, quite often there's a reference to a girl that he's going to or that he's leaving. And there definitely is... but what I think is quite interesting when I was, and I'm not by no means an expert, but when I was reading the poems, it's more what isn't there. A lot of the poems at this time wrote about the land as a mother. Bande Mataram, even Amashona Bangla has this kind of imagery of the land as a mother. And that, again, has certain religious connotations because it's Mother India, it's Kali, it's the goddess. But he avoids that. There's hardly, in fact, I didn't find in Rupashi Bangla any references at all to the land as a mother. So again, a woman that comforts us is something that is available to all of us. And I think that particular imagery that is throughout his poem is also very universal. It's not linked to a particular tradition or myth or religion. So, yeah, thank you. I mean, it was... so I only had 40 minutes. I sort of talking about poetry can be quite dense. But thank you for bringing that up because it was something that I noticed myself as I was reading.
It's very special of his poetical life. It's a very special, unique poem. I mean, if I read that hour after hour, still it won't be bored.
Yeah.
And also another thing, myself, personally, I feel very saddened his last life. Probably he was, due to partition, moving here and there, job loss and everything. He lost all the financial identity
absolutely.
to maintain family and everything. And some people say he committed suicide.
Yeah, it's uncertain, isn't it? And he actually wrote, again, I haven't read them, but he wrote a series of very realistic novels about the kind of economic difficulties that people faced, which are very different from these. I mean, they're very much in the social realism style. But yeah, absolutely, thank you.
And another thing, sorry, I'm to be because that time, the history of India, when British quits, give freedom and quit, right? And it was like a whirlwind within the ocean. I mean, the subcontinental human mass body is a kind of this kind of flow going, who is where and who is where, dying, living, sustainity. It was like that kind of scenario. And that's also, he, gone through that period of time. Because 1946, and then he came to Calcutta and died in 50.
That's right, and there's a whole series of poems after that, yeah.
Same thing happened to Sheikh Mujib. He left Calcutta in 1946, come to East Pakistan.
So he was the other way.
Such a genius people of all kind.
Yeah, I mean, there was a lot of loss at that time. People were losing land that they were familiar with. Sorry, did you have a question? Yeah, go on.
Not quite a question, but some comments on this topic.
Yeah.
And then the poem that I think he was meaning is called Bonanata
So, yeah, that's right, yeah.
And so that's that identity. And you talked about the land of Bengal not being motherland, so to speak. But I think this, move from the idea of a motherland to the land as a lover. One of the Shen is definitely more of a lover, imagined as more of a lover than a mother.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this move is could be linked to the idea that Jibanananda was the first Bengali modernist. So this move from romanticism to modernism, this poem is romantic enough, and the book Rupashi Bangla itself is quite romantic. But he ultimately, slowly was moving towards modernism, and the signs of that movement are apparent in this book as well. So his kind of romanticism, although he was a Brahmo, was quite different from Rabindranath's romanticism.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. Tagore's romanticism.
Yeah. For Tagore, it was sort of transcendentalism.
There are differences which come out in the letters, exchange of letters between the...
Okay, those I haven't read, so you have to tell me. Okay, yeah.
So this kind of modernism is setting in, and my question is that would you say that this modernism is still linked with the, what is the link between these two facets of Jibanananda? We know two quite different Jibananandas, because he has moved to the urban milieu.
Yeah,
then
he starts to write about that.
Different kind of poetry later in life.
He does. I think what I say to you is,
what is the link between
well, I suppose this is the dream. This is what he left behind. You say his romanticism is different from Tagore's, and I think that's right, because in these poems what you feel is there is only nature, there is only rivers, there is only the birds, there is nothing beyond that. There's no kind of unifying form that is going to bring everything together, which is what you get, I think, in Tagore's work. So there is a very different it's a very different sort of romanticism. But these poems, they're very melancholy, I think. Although they're beautiful, they are melancholic. And I think almost in a way it is a lament. He was an intelligent man. He moved back because of communal tensions. He must have seen what was coming. He then moved again, like so many people, from West Bengal to East Bengal, East Bengal to West Bengal, lost their land. And there's this sense of melancholy in these poems, I think, which links, it's this dream that the later poems, I've read them, and they're a bit more chaotic, because they're not so... Because who has the answers? Nobody has the answers.
Alienated.
Yeah, exactly. They're alienated. That's a facet of modernism. And this is. It's not that nature, the world that he was living in, was the answer, but that was a life that was disrupted, not so much by the industrial forces. This was by political and religious forces. So I think that kind of melancholy in Rupashi Bangla then goes forward into his more obviously modernist work. But I think also the absence of any kind of transcendental force in this, in Rupashi Bangla, is also quite modernist. I think one of the writers
Absolutely. It's much more focused on nature only, like quite Keatsian, I would say, rather than the earlier romantic tradition.
Absolutely, it's not like Wordsworth or anything like that. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree with you. Thank you.
But isn't the nature the transcendental force? Nature is...
Well, I think maybe, unless I've misunderstood you, I think what we were saying is that when you read the poems, nature's the only thing. So it's not transcendent, because a bird isn't a bird is a bird, a puddle is a puddle, a duckweed is duckweed, and you feel that completely.
Transcendent. more of an immanence than...
It's something that you completely feel and experience, but there's no wider meaning to it than...
It's an immersion.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's immersive rather than transcendent, which kind of takes it out to the whole Brahmo thing. But remember, he wasn't an active Brahmo. You know, he grew up in that. But
you said at the beginning that many young people joined the 1970 war through these.
Well, I'm not sure they joined it because they joined because, they certainly spoke to them. It was very popular during the 71 war.
Some were inspired by it.
Yeah, okay. Well, you know more.
I was just thinking that this the whole creation of Pakistan. So so people were on religious grounds.
But
so
Bangladesh is a secular country. Don't forget, Bangladesh was established as a secular country.
Before.
Oh, before. Oh, sorry, you're talking about 47.
So you've got people that are willing to kill their fellow humans for religion, and whereas and yet we talk about the land as our mother. The land gives us our life, but religion is something. It's something else. So with the state of Bangladesh and what happened in the Indian subcontinent after 1947, where Muslims came together for religion, but really that wasn't the uniting force, which is why Bangladesh came into being.
Absolutely, yeah.
So he's like going back to saying, the land is more important than superficial religion.
Well, I think that it also is. I kind of wanted to avoid this. I thought it might be a bit too kind of controversial, but as we've gone into it now, what I kind of thought was that. Really, the 71 war, from my kind of perspective, established Bangladesh as a secular state. So it wasn't denying that it embraced everybody. That poster you saw after 71, Amra, Bangla, Muslim, Christian, Boyd, Amra, Shobai, Bangli. It was saying, Bengal, Christians, Hindus, Muslims.
But they kept the Islamic Republic of Bangladesh.
No, it became Islamic Republic again, but it was established, our constitution established as a secular republic, and then under Ershad, you're right, it's gone back to, this is why I say this is a dream we really need to hold on to. But they've changed the constitution, haven't they?
They did, they call it state religion.
It's back, yeah, but it's back there again. Yeah, it's not so, but it's back there, it's a religion of but the actual original constitution, it was set up as a secular country, there was no mention of religion.
But Jinnah also wanted Pakistan to be a secular country.
You know more than me then, yeah. It wouldn't surprise me because he never seemed to be particularly...
in the beginning it was, Pakistan was supposed to be secular.
Was it?
It's only later when the dictatorship takes over.
Really?
Well, most people on their side. So they studied in religion as something for personal gain. Political gain.
I mean, Jibanananda seems to me in many ways very Bangladeshi, although, he's from Bengal, and he went back to Calcutta, but his whole kind of... the way he thinks about the land, the way he thinks about religion, about people, seems to me very much what the forces that originally inspired the 71 war of Bangladesh.
What was the...
Well, it was this thing of, it was... It was culture. It's our land. Whether we're Hindu, Muslim, Christian, our land is the land of Bengal. Our culture is the culture of Bengal, and that can be a syncretic culture, which I think is very much where Jibanananda is coming from. He doesn't mention in Rupashi Bangla any shrines, any mosques, any temples, at all.
Yes, and I think this is, at least in Rupashi Bangla, there's a lack of any ideological or religious or even social context. We do know this context from other sources, but there's a lack of mention of any of them, and I think this is very peculiar about Jibanananda, that this poem, for example, mentions that the world's beauty I need no longer seek. So, this kind of insularism is quite peculiar to him as a poet. And for this reason, I think, because no matter, agree with me. And somebody said that he was a teacher of English. was quite well up in his literature, and he had himself translated quite a few of his own poems into English. But nevertheless, I mean, I don't quite feel the kind of magic that he could wield with words can be quite translated into English.
I think that's right.
He being the, greatest poetic genius after Tagore, most people would kind of agree with me on this. So what do you make of this insularity in him and the tendency to remain apart from all this contextuality and to remain a lone man within nature?
Yeah, and that's what the Clinton Seeney biography is called A Poet Apart. It kind of focuses on that. I think, in a way, that is a deliberate choice in these poems by making it such a sensual experience. The poems, everybody can access that. Even somebody outside Bengal could access that. And there were so many social, religious forces at that time during partition that I think and he does in his later poetry, I think, try and kind of make some sort of sense of that. But that poetry, for me, speaks, and I think for most people, it speaks less strongly to people than Rupashi Bangla. And that, to me, speaks of a universality, not in a kind of universality is it's a word that really doesn't mean very much sometimes. But really, in the true sense of the word, by reading in the poems of Rupashi Bangla, by getting rid of all that context, even the context in his own village, the things he's not talking about, they're clearly in his village that he's not talking about, or his town. He allows that experience to be experienced by everybody. But then again, to some extent, to understand what he's trying to do, you do also need to read around, what he did and what he was saying. So that's my views. But thank you very much. I've learned a lot today myself, so thank you. All right. Yeah, I'm finishing. Thank you.